Mark and Jenna made their way through the winding corridors, moving as quickly and quietly as they could. The house was silent, but there was an oppressive weight in the air, as if it were watching their every move. Finally, they came upon the library, a large, dimly lit room filled with old books and dusty shelves. The sight of it brought back the memory of the journals Mark had found earlier, the ones that detailed the horrific experiments conducted in the house. Mark led Jenna to the shelf where he had found the journals, pulling one down and opening it to the pages that had chilled him to the bone. "Look," he said, showing her the handwritten entries. Jenna's eyes widened as she read, her face pale. These are records. Of what they did here. Of what the house did." Mark nodded grimly. "I think this place was used for psychological experiments, maybe even something worse. They were trying to break people's minds, to manipulate them. And now it's doing the same to us," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "But why? What does it want?" "I don't know," Mark said, closing the journal. "But whatever it is, it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." Jenna looked at him, her fear evident. "So what do we do?" "We use this," Mark said, holding up the journal. "We use what they wrote, what they learned, against it. If the house is trying to manipulate us, then we need to stay one step ahead of it. We have to keep our minds clear, not let it get inside our heads." Jenna nodded slowly, her resolve hardening. "We have to outsmart it." "Exactly," Mark said. "We can't let it break us." Together, they began to read through the journals, searching for any clue, any hint that might help them escape the house's grasp. The more they read, the more horrifying the truth became. The experiments had been designed to push people to their limits, to break their minds and reshape them into something else. And the house was continuing that work, using their fears and weaknesses against them. But Mark and Jenna were determined to resist. They wouldn't let the house win. With the journals in hand, Mark and Jenna made their way back through the house, their minds racing with what they had learned. The house was a trap, a psychological weapon designed to break them down and force them to confront their deepest fears. As they entered the kitchen, Mark's eyes were drawn once again to the old dentist chair in the center of the room. It was a symbol of everything the house represented, a place of torment, of psychological manipulation. And now, it was the focal point of their struggle. Mark set the journals on the counter, turning to Jenna. "This chair, it's more than just a piece of furniture. It's part of the house's plan. It's meant to break us, to force us to confront something we're not ready to face." Jenna nodded, her expression grim. "But we're ready now. We know what the house is trying to do, and we're not going to let it." Mark looked at the chair, a sense of dread washing over him. He knew what they had to do, but the thought of sitting in that chair, of facing whatever the house had in store, terrified him. But he couldn't let fear control him. He had to face it, just as he had faced everything else in this house. "Let's finish this," Mark said, his voice steady. Together, they approached the chair, the air in the room growing colder, heavier. The house seemed to sense their resolve, its presence pressing down on them with a malevolent force. Mark reached out, pulling back the sheet that covered the chair. The leather was cold to the touch, the metal gleaming faintly in the dim light. "Are you ready?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. Mark took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "As ready as I'll ever be." He sat down in the chair, the cold metal biting into his skin. Jenna stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, offering what little comfort she could. The house seemed to shift around them, the walls closing in, the shadows growing darker. Mark could feel the presence of the house, a malevolent force that was waiting, watching. But he wasn't going to let it win. He was ready to face whatever the house had in store. And he was going to survive. The air in the kitchen grew thick with tension as Mark sat in the dentist chair, his heart racing with fear and anticipation. Jenna stood beside him, her hand still resting on his shoulder, a steadying presence in the midst of the storm. They both knew that this was the moment they had been dreading, the moment when the house would make its final move. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and the woman stepped into the room, her expression cold and unreadable. She moved with the same unnerving calm, her eyes fixed on Mark as she approached the chair. "It's time," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. Mark gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles white. "What are you going to do to me?" The woman didn't answer directly. Instead, she began to speak in the same hypnotic tone she had used before, her words wrapping around Mark like a fog. "You've been running from the truth for so long, Mark. But now, there's nowhere left to run. It's time to face what you've been hiding." Mark felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as her words began to take hold, seeping into his mind. He tried to resist, to push back against the pull of her voice, but it was like trying to fight against a tide. "You've been so afraid, Mark," the woman continued, her voice soothing, almost maternal. "Afraid of who you are, of what you've done. But you don't have to be afraid anymore. You can let go of that fear, let it wash over you, and finally be free." Mark's vision began to blur as the woman's voice grew louder in his mind, drowning out his thoughts. He could feel the house pressing in on him, its presence overwhelming, as if it were inside him, controlling him. But he couldn't give in. He had to hold on to his sense of self, had to remember who he was, what he was fighting for. "I won't let you win," Mark whispered, his voice shaking with the effort of resistance. The woman's expression darkened, her calm facade slipping. "You don't have a choice, Mark. The house will break you, just as it has broken everyone else. It's inevitable." Mark gritted his teeth, his mind racing as he tried to find something, anything, to hold on to. He thought of his family, his friends, the life he had before he entered this house. He thought of Jenna, standing beside him, her presence a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. He wouldn't let the house take that from him. With a surge of determination, Mark forced himself to focus on the things that mattered, the things that grounded him in reality. He could feel the house pushing against his mind, trying to tear down his defenses, but he held on, clinging to the memories, the emotions that made him who he was. The woman's voice faltered, her control slipping as Mark fought back. She tried to regain her composure, but Mark could see the cracks forming in her calm facade. "You're stronger than this, Mark," Jenna said, her voice cutting through the fog. "You can fight it. You don't have to let the house win." Mark's grip on the chair tightened as he felt Jenna's words bolster his resolve. The house was strong, but he was stronger. He wouldn't let it break him. With a final effort, Mark pushed back against the house's influence, reclaiming his mind, his sense of self. The darkness that had threatened to consume him began to recede, the house's hold weakening. The woman's expression twisted with frustration as she realized she was losing control. She stepped back from the chair, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Mark. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice venomous. "The house will always be a part of you. You can't escape it." Mark met her gaze, his voice steady as he spoke. "Maybe I can't escape it, but I can live with it. And I won't let it control me." The woman's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned and left the kitchen, the door slamming shut behind her. The tension in the room began to dissipate, the oppressive presence of the house fading into the background. Mark slumped in the chair, exhausted but victorious. He had faced the house, faced the truth it had tried to force upon him. And he had won. Jenna squeezed his shoulder, her voice filled with relief. You did it, Mark. You beat it. Mark nodded, too tired to speak. He had won this battle, but he knew the war wasn't over. The house was still there, still a part of him. But for now, he had control. And that was enough. The kitchen was silent, the air thick with the residue of tension from the confrontation that had just taken place. Mark sat in the old dentist chair, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps as he tried to recover from the mental battle he had just fought. Jenna stood beside him, her hand still resting on his shoulder, a steady presence that kept him anchored to reality. But the house wasn't done with him yet. As the minutes ticked by, Mark could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a creeping sense of unease that wormed its way into his mind. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening and stretching across the room. It was as if the house was gathering its strength, preparing for one final assault. Mark straightened in the chair, his muscles tensing as he prepared himself for whatever was coming. He had won the last round, but he knew the house wouldn't give up easily. It would come at him again, harder this time, more determined to break him. Stay with me, Mark, Jenna whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Don't let it pull you back. In. Mark nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the shifting shadows. He could feel the house's presence pressing against him, probing for any weakness it could exploit. It was a game of wills, and the house was a formidable opponent. The first assault came in the form of memories, fragmented, disjointed images from Mark's past. That flashed before his eyes. He saw his father, his stern face twisted in disappointment, his mother, her back turned as she walked away, his friends, their faces blurred and distant. Each memory was tinged with guilt, regret, and a deep-seated fear that he had failed them all. Mark clenched his fists, his knuckles white as he fought to keep his mind focused. The house was trying to overwhelm him with the weight of his past, to drown him in the emotions he had spent so long burying. But he couldn't let it. He had to stay in control. You're stronger than this, Jenna said, her voice firm. Don't let the house take that from you. But the memories kept coming, faster and more intense. Mark felt as if he were being pulled under, suffocated by the emotions that had haunted him for years. His vision blurred, his thoughts spiraling out of control as the house pushed harder, its influence growing stronger. And then, just when Mark thought he might break, he heard Jenna's voice again, clear and steady, cutting through the chaos. Mark, focus on me. Look at me. Mark forced his gaze away from the shifting shadows and met Jenna's eyes. Her expression was filled with determination, and something else, a deep, unwavering belief in him. She wasn't just a voice in the storm, she was a lifeline, something solid and real that he could hold on to. Don't let it win, she said, her grip on his shoulder tightening. You're stronger than this. You've already proven that. Mark felt a surge of resolve, a flicker of hope that had been nearly extinguished by the house's relentless assault. He focused on Jenna, on her words, on the truth that she was speaking. He was stronger than the house. He had fought back before, and he could do it again. The memories began to fade, the shadows retreating as Mark regained control of his mind. The house pushed against him, but he pushed back, refusing to let it dictate his thoughts, his emotions. He wasn't going to let it win. Slowly, the pressure eased, the house's presence withdrawing like a tide that had reached its peak and was now receding. Mark's breath came easier, his heart rate slowing as the sense of suffocation lifted. He had survived the house's attack, but he knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The real battle was still ahead. Mark and Jenna stood side by side in the dimly lit kitchen, the air heavy with the remnants of the House's influence. The old dentist chair loomed in the center of the room, a stark reminder of the psychological warfare that had just taken place. But Mark wasn't going to let it intimidate him anymore. He had fought off the house's first assault, but he knew it would come at him again. This time, though, he wasn't going to wait for it to attack. He was going to take the fight to the house. "Jenna," Mark said, his voice steady, "we can't keep reacting to what the house throws at us. We need to go on the offensive." Jenna looked at him, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "What do you mean? How do we fight something like this?" Mark's mind raced as he thought back to the journals they had found, the notes on the psychological experiments conducted in the house. The people who had been trapped here before them had tried to resist, but they hadn't known what they were up against. They hadn't had the information that he and Jenna now possessed. "We use what we've learned," Mark said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "The house is trying to break us down, to make us vulnerable by using our own fears and memories against us. But that means it's operating on a level we can understand, a level we can fight back on." Jenna's eyes widened as she began to grasp what Mark was saying. "You think we can outsmart it?" Mark nodded. "It's like a psychological game. The house is trying to manipulate us, but if we can anticipate its moves, if we can use our knowledge to counteract its tactics, we might be able to turn the tables." Jenna hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay. But how do we start?" Mark thought for a moment, then turned his gaze to the dentist chair. It had been a symbol of fear, a tool used by the house to intimidate and control. But what if they could strip it of that power? What if they could turn it into a weapon against the house? "I'm going to sit in the chair," Mark said, his voice firm. Jenna's eyes widened in alarm. "What? No, Mark, you can't." "I have to," Mark interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The house uses the chair to get inside our heads, to break us down. But if I sit in it willingly, if I face it on my own terms, I might be able to disrupt its control." Jenna looked at him, fear and concern etched on her face. "Are you sure about this?" Mark nodded. "It's a risk, but it's one I'm willing to take. We have to fight back, Jenna. We can't just keep running." Jenna hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded reluctantly. "Okay. But I'm staying with you. I'm not leaving you alone." Mark smiled faintly, grateful for her support. "I wouldn't want it any other way." He walked over to the chair, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The leather was cold against his skin as he sat down, the metal frame creaking slightly under his weight. Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever was about to happen. "Let's see what you've got," he muttered under his breath, challenging the house to do its worst. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent, the shadows still. But then, slowly, the air around them began to change. The temperature dropped, the light dimming until the kitchen was bathed in a cold, eerie glow. Mark felt the pressure of the house's presence returning, but this time, he was ready for it. He focused his mind, pushing back against the house's influence, refusing to let it take control. He could feel it probing, trying to find a way in, but he held firm, using the techniques he had learned from the journals to block its attempts. Beside him, Jenna stood with her hand on his shoulder, her presence a comforting anchor. Together, they fought off the house's advances, their combined strength holding it at bay. And then, something incredible happened. The house hesitated. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Mark felt it, a momentary pause in the house's assault. As if it was unsure of what to do next. Mark seized on that hesitation, pushing back harder. forcing the house to retreat. "We're doing it," Jenna whispered, her voice filled with awe. "We're actually doing it." Mark gritted his teeth, focusing all his energy on maintaining control. "Keep pushing. We can't let it recover." Together, they pressed the attack, using their knowledge and determination to weaken the house's hold. The shadows in the room flickered, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as the house began to lose its grip. They were winning. But the victory was short-lived. Just as Mark and Jenna began to feel the house's control slipping, the atmosphere in the kitchen shifted again. The shadows deepened, the temperature plummeting as the house rallied its strength for one final, desperate assault. The walls of the kitchen seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the light flickering wildly as the house unleashed its full fury. Mark felt the pressure return, stronger than ever, as the house pushed back against their efforts, determined to regain control. The room began to twist and warp, the walls closing in on them as the house exerted its power. Mark could feel it trying to break through his defenses, to tear down the mental barriers he had constructed. His grip on the chair tightened as he fought to hold on, but the house was relentless, its assault unyielding. Beside him, Jenna gasped as the pressure increased, her grip on his shoulder tightening. "Mark, it's too strong. I don't know if we can hold it off." Mark's heart raced as he struggled to maintain control, the house's influence battering against his mind like a storm. He could feel his strength waning, the mental exhaustion taking its toll. The house was using everything it had, every trick, every tactic, to break them down. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, twisting into grotesque shapes that danced at the edges of Mark's vision. The walls creaked and groaned as if they were about to collapse, the floor beneath them trembling with the force of the house's power. Mark's vision blurred as the pressure mounted, the house's influence overwhelming his senses. He could feel it digging into his mind, searching for a way in, trying to exploit any weakness it could find. And then, it found one. A memory surfaced, unbidden and unwanted, a memory that Mark had buried deep within his mind. It was a memory of failure, of a moment when he had let someone down, when he had been unable to protect someone he cared about. The house latched onto that memory, amplifying the guilt and shame that came with it. Mark's defenses wavered as the house flooded his mind with images of that failure, twisting the memory into something even darker, more painful. "You failed," the house seemed to whisper, its voice a cold, mocking echo in his mind. "You couldn't save them. You were too weak." Mark's grip on the chair faltered as the guilt and shame threatened to overwhelm him. The house was using his own emotions against him, turning his past mistakes into weapons that cut deeper than any physical wound. But just as Mark felt himself slipping, Jenna's voice cut through the darkness, clear and strong. "Mark, don't listen to it. That's not who you are. You're stronger than this." Her words were like a lifeline, pulling him back from the brink. Mark's resolve hardened as he pushed back against the house's influence, refusing to let it define him by his past mistakes. He wasn't going to let the house win. With a surge of strength, Mark forced the memory back, locking it away where the house couldn't reach it. He could feel the house's frustration, its desperation as it realized that its tactic had failed. But the house wasn't done yet. In a final, desperate move, the house began to distort the very fabric of the room around them. The walls twisted and bent, the floor shifting beneath their feet as the house tried to disorient them, to throw them off balance. Mark and Jenna stumbled as the room warped around them, the light flickering wildly. The house was using every ounce of its power, every trick and tactic, to break them down. But Mark wasn't going to let it. He pushed back with everything he had, his mind focused and determined. The house's influence was strong, but Mark was stronger. He had fought off its assaults before, and he would do it again. Together, he and Jenna held their ground, refusing to let the house break them. The room continued to twist and warp, the shadows growing darker, but Mark and Jenna stood firm, their resolve unshaken. And then, slowly, the house's power began to wane. The shadows receded, the room gradually returning to its normal state. The pressure eased, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as the house's influence weakened. Mark took a deep breath, his body trembling with exhaustion. They had survived the house's final assault, but he knew the battle wasn't over yet. The house had been weakened, but it wasn't defeated. Not yet. Mark and Jenna stood in the now still kitchen, the air heavy with the aftermath of the house's assault. Mark was exhausted, his mind reeling from the battle they had just fought. But he knew they couldn't rest yet. The house was weakened, but it wasn't defeated, and they had to take advantage of that weakness. Jenna, however, could see the toll the battle had taken on Mark. His face was pale, his eyes haunted by the memories the house had dredged up. She knew he was pushing himself to the limit, and if they didn't find a way to end this soon, the house would break him. "Mark," Jenna said softly, her voice filled with concern. "You need to rest. You're exhausted." Mark shook his head, his determination clear despite his fatigue. "I can't rest, Jenna. We're so close. We just have to push a little further." Jenna took a step closer, her hand resting on his arm. "I know you want to keep fighting, but you need to take care of yourself. If you push too hard, the house will find a way to exploit that. You have to be at your best if we're going to win this." Mark looked at her, his expression torn. He knew she was right, but the thought of stopping, even for a moment, filled him with a sense of dread. What if the house recovered while he rested? What if it came at them even harder, and he wasn't ready to fight back? But Jenna's gaze was steady, her belief in him unwavering. She wasn't just worried about his physical exhaustion, she was worried about what the house was doing to him mentally, emotionally. He could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that if he didn't take care of himself, he might not be able to keep fighting. "Okay," Mark said finally, his voice soft. "But just for a minute." Jenna nodded, relieved that he was listening to her. She guided him to the edge of the kitchen, where he could sit down on one of the old, worn chairs. Mark sank into the seat, his body heavy with fatigue. Jenna knelt beside him, her hand resting on his knee. "You're doing so well, Mark. You've been so strong. But you don't have to do this alone. I'm here with you, and we're going to get through this together." Mark looked down at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Jenna. You've been my anchor through all of this." Jenna smiled faintly, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "And you've been mine. We're stronger together than we are apart." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through settling over them. The house was still there, still watching, but for the first time, Mark felt like they had the upper hand. They had pushed back against its influence, and though it wasn't defeated, it was weakened. But Jenna knew that they couldn't let their guard down. The house was a living entity, and it would continue to adapt, to evolve in its attempts to break them. They had to stay one step ahead, had to find a way to end this once and for all. "Mark," Jenna said, her voice firm, "we need to find the source of the house's power. We need to find whatever is keeping it alive, keeping it strong." Mark looked at her, his exhaustion replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. "You're right. We Need to find the heart of this place and destroy it. Jenna nodded, her resolve matching his. But we need to be careful. The house knows we're a threat now. It's going to do everything it can to stop us. Mark stood up, his strength returning as the adrenaline kicked in. Then we won't give it the chance. We'll strike before it can regroup. Together, they left the kitchen, their minds focused on the task ahead. The house was weakened, but it was still dangerous. They had to find the source of its power, and they had to destroy it before it destroyed them. Mark and Jenna made their way through the twisting corridors of the house, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The house seemed to sense their determination, the shadows growing darker, the air colder as they moved closer to its heart. But Mark and Jenna were no longer afraid. They had faced the house's worst, and they had survived. They knew its tactics, its tricks, and they were ready to end this once and for all. Finally, they came to a large, ornate door at the end of a long hallway. The door was old, the wood dark and polished, with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and move in the dim light. It was clear that this door led to the heart of the house, the source of its power. Mark reached out, his hand resting on the cold metal of the doorknob. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever was on the other side. "Are you ready?" he asked, looking at Jenna. She nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Let's finish this." Mark turned the doorknob and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking as it swung inward. The room beyond was dark, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. But Mark and Jenna didn't hesitate. They stepped inside, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The room was large, the walls lined with old, faded tapestries that depicted scenes of suffering and torment. At the center of the room was a large, circular table, and on that table was an ancient-looking book, its pages yellowed with age. Mark and Jenna approached the table cautiously, their eyes fixed on the book. It seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air around it crackling with power. "This must be it," Jenna whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. "This is what's keeping the house alive." Mark nodded, his heart pounding. "We need to destroy it." He reached out to touch the book, but as his fingers brushed the cover, a wave of darkness surged through the room. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, swirling together to form a shape, a figure made of darkness, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The figure moved toward them, its presence filling the room with a sense of dread. Mark and Jenna took a step back, their hearts racing as the figure loomed over them. "You cannot destroy me," the figure hissed, its voice echoing in the darkness. "I am eternal. I am the house, and you are nothing." Mark clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "You're wrong. You're just a manifestation of fear, of the darkness inside this place. And we're not afraid of you." The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down their spines. "You think you can defeat me? You think you can destroy this house? You are fools." But Mark wasn't intimidated. He had faced his fears, he had fought back against the house's influence, and he had won. He wasn't going to back down now. "We're stronger than you," Mark said, his voice filled with conviction. "And we're going to end this." Jenna stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "We're not afraid of you. You don't control us." The figure's eyes narrowed, its form flickering as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. "You cannot win. This house will consume you, as it has consumed so many before you." Mark and Jenna exchanged a glance, their minds in sync. They knew what they had to do. Together, they lunged for the book, their hands reaching for the ancient pages. The figure screamed in rage, its form dissolving into a whirlwind of shadows as they touched the book. But it was too late. As their hands made contact with the book, a surge of energy coursed through the room. The shadows were sucked back into the book, the figure's screams fading as it was pulled into the pages. The book glowed with a bright, blinding light, and then, with a final burst of energy, it disintegrated into dust. The room was plunged into silence, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as the house's power was broken. Mark and Jenna stood there, breathing heavily, their hearts pounding with the realization of what they had just done. They had defeated the house. They had destroyed its source of power. It was over. Mark and Jenna made their way back through the house, the corridors now silent and still. The oppressive presence that had once filled the air was gone, the shadows no longer twisting and shifting in the corners of their vision. They reached the front door, the same door that had been locked when Mark had first tried to escape. But now, as he reached for the doorknob, it turned easily in his hand. The door swung open, and they stepped out into the cool night air. The sky was clear, the stars twinkling above them, and the street was quiet and empty. Mark took a deep breath, the fresh air filling his lungs. He could hardly believe it, they were free. The house was behind them, its power broken, its influence gone. Jenna stepped up beside him, her hand slipping into his. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. Mark nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions. "We did." They stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet night, the weight of their ordeal slowly lifting from their shoulders. Finally, Mark turned to Jenna, his expression serious. "We need to make sure this place is destroyed. We can't let it hurt anyone else." Jenna nodded in agreement. "We'll find a way." They walked away from the house, the door closing softly behind them. As they moved down the street, Mark glanced back one last time, his eyes lingering on the dark silhouette of the house. It was over. But the memory of what had happened there would stay with him, a reminder of the darkness they had faced, and the strength they had found within themselves. Together, they walked into the night, leaving the house behind, but carrying with them the knowledge that they had faced the darkness, and they had won. The quiet of the night was a stark contrast to the chaos that had reigned inside the house. As Mark and Jenna walked down the deserted street, the oppressive weight that had hung over them for so long began to lift. The air was cool, and a gentle breeze ruffled their hair, carrying with it the faint scent of the nearby woods. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were free. But freedom came with a cost. Mark's mind was still reeling from the battle they had just fought. The images of the house, the dark figure, and the twisting shadows were seared into his memory, lingering like an unwanted echo. He couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental within him had changed, that the house had left a permanent mark on his soul. Beside him, Jenna walked in silence, her hand still clasped in his. Her grip was firm, but Mark could sense the exhaustion in her every step, the way her shoulders slumped and her head hung low. They had won, but the victory felt hollow, tinged with a deep, lingering sadness. After a while, they reached a small park at the edge of the neighborhood. Mark guided Jenna to a bench under a large oak tree, its branches casting long, comforting shadows in the moonlight. They sat down, the wood creaking under their weight, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Mark stared at the ground, his mind a whirl of thoughts and emotions. He knew they had done the right thing, that destroying the house had been necessary, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had lost something in the process, something intangible, but profoundly important. Finally, Jenna broke the silence, her voice soft and filled with emotion. "Do you think it's really over?" Mark looked up, meeting her gaze. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty, a reflection of the same doubts that plagued him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I want to believe it is. But I think the house will always be with us, in some way." Jenna nodded, her expression somber. "It changed us, didn't it?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I think it did. We faced things in there. Things that were buried deep inside us. Things we didn't want to confront. And I don't think we can just walk away from that." Jenna's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can ever forget what happened in there. The things I saw, the things I felt, they're going to haunt me." Mark reached out, taking her hand again and squeezing it gently. "You're not alone, Jenna. We went through this together. And we'll get through the aftermath together too." Jenna looked back at him, her tears spilling over. "I'm scared, Mark. I'm scared of what this has done to us." Mark felt a lump in his throat, but he forced himself to speak, to offer her the reassurance she needed. "We're stronger than we were before. We faced the worst the house could throw at us. And we came out on the other side. It won't be easy, but we can heal. We can move forward." Jenna nodded, wiping her tears away. "You're right. We have to keep going. We can't let the house win, even now." They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of what they had been through settling over them like a heavy blanket. But despite the fear and uncertainty, there was a glimmer of hope, a sense that, somehow, they would find a way to rebuild their lives. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions for Mark. On the surface, life returned to something resembling normalcy. He went back to his college classes, trying to focus on his studies, to immerse himself in the routine of lectures, assignments, and exams. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. The memories of the house were always there, lurking at the edges of his consciousness, ready to surface at the slightest provocation. A shadow moving in the corner of his eye, the creak of a floorboard, the flicker of a light bulb, each one sent a jolt of fear through him, a reminder of the darkness he had faced. Mark's friends noticed the change in him, though they didn't understand its source. They asked him if he was okay, if something was bothering him, but Mark couldn't bring himself to explain. How could he make them understand what he had been through? How could he describe the terror, the despair, the sheer horror of what he and Jenna had faced? So he kept it to himself, pushing the memories down, trying to bury them as deep as they would go. But they never stayed buried for long. At night, they came back in his dreams, twisted, nightmarish visions that left him drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He would wake up in the dark, gasping for breath, the shadows of his dorm room pressing in on him. And for a few moments, he would be back in the house, trapped in its suffocating grip, the walls closing in around him. But it wasn't just the memories that haunted him. It was the sense of disconnection, the feeling that he was no longer the same person he had been before. The house had changed him in ways he couldn't fully understand, and he struggled to reconcile that change with the life he had returned to. Mark found himself withdrawing from his friends, spending more and more time alone. He skipped social events, avoided gatherings, and spent hours in his dorm room, staring at the walls, lost in thought. The world outside felt distant, unreal, as if he were watching it through a thick pane of glass. The only person who understood, the only person who could reach him, was Jenna. They spoke often, meeting in quiet, secluded places where they could talk without fear of being overheard. They shared their experiences, their fears, their nightmares, finding solace in each other's company. But even with Jenna, there was a sense of distance, a feeling that the house had created a barrier between them that they couldn't quite overcome. They had survived together, but they were also scarred in ways that made it difficult to connect, to find comfort in each other's presence. It was a lonely, isolating existence, and Mark began to wonder if he would ever truly escape the shadow of the house. The turning point came on a rainy afternoon, several weeks after the night they had escaped the house. Mark had been avoiding the park where he and Jenna had talked after their escape, but something drew him back there that day. He needed a place to think, to confront the thoughts that had been swirling in his mind since that night. He found the same bench under the oak tree and sat down, the rain drizzling around him, the world a grey blur. The park was empty, the only sound the patter of raindrops on the leaves and the distant rumble of thunder. Mark sat in silence, letting the rain wash over him, the cold seeping into his bones. The memories of the house were there, as always, but this time, he didn't try to push them away. He let them come, let them play out in his mind, confronting each one as it surfaced. He saw the twisting corridors, the flickering shadows, the faces in the portraits that had haunted him. He saw the old dentist chair, the woman's cold eyes, the dark figure that had threatened to consume them. He felt the fear, the guilt, the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had nearly broken him. But as he sat there, facing those memories, something shifted inside him. The fear was still there, the trauma still fresh, but he realized that he had survived. He had faced the darkness, and he had come out the other side. The house had changed him, yes, but it hadn't destroyed him. Mark took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and slowly, he began to let go. He let go of the guilt, the shame, the sense of failure that had weighed him down. He let go of the fear, the doubt, the lingering shadows of the past. He wasn't the same person he had been before, but that didn't mean he was broken. He had been tested, and he had emerged stronger, more resilient. The house had left its mark on him, but it hadn't defined him. As the rain continued to fall, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him, a calm that he hadn't felt since that night. He knew the memories would always be with him, that the house would always be a part of his story. But he also knew that he could move forward, that he could build a new life, one that wasn't defined by fear or trauma. He wasn't alone. Jenna had gone through the same ordeal, and together, they could help each other heal, find a way to move on. Mark stood up from the bench, the rain still falling around him, and made a decision. He wasn't going to let the house control his life anymore. He was going to confront the trauma, to face it head on, and to find a way to move beyond it. And he knew that Jenna would be by his side, just as she had been throughout their ordeal. Months later, Mark and Jenna had made significant progress in their recovery. They had sought professional help, talking through their experiences with therapists who helped them process the trauma they had endured. They had built new routines, found new interests, and slowly but surely, they were reclaiming their lives. But the memories of the house were never far away. They lingered in the corners of their minds, a constant reminder of the darkness they had faced. Sometimes, when Mark was alone in his dorm room, or when Jenna was lying in bed at night, they would feel the weight of those memories pressing down on them, a faint echo of the fear that had once consumed them. One evening, Mark was studying in his dorm room when he noticed something strange. The light above his desk flickered, just for a moment, casting the room in a brief, unsettling shadow. Mark froze, his heart skipping a beat as the memory of the house flooded back. But then, just as quickly, the light steadied, returning to its normal glow. The room was the same as it had always been, safe, familiar, ordinary. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hand trembling slightly. The house was gone, its power broken. But its memory would always be with him, a reminder of what he had faced and what he had overcome. And in a strange way, Mark realized that he was okay with that. The house had changed him, but it hadn't destroyed him. It had forced him to confront his deepest fears, his darkest memories, and he had emerged stronger for it. As he sat back in his chair, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him. The memories of the house were still there, but they no longer held the same power over him. They were part of his story, but they didn't define him. He was free. And so was Jenna. The final echo of the house faded into the background, leaving Mark with the quiet assurance that he had faced the darkness, and he had won.